Picture this. You're walking alone down a dimly lit hallway in the dead of night. The floorboards creak beneath your feet with every step you take. Suddenly, you hear it, a whisper, a voice calling your name from somewhere in the darkness ahead. Your heart pounds as you realize you're completely alone in this building. Where are you? Tonight, I'm taking you inside 10 of America's most haunted buildings where the living share space with the dead. These aren't just old structures with creaky floors and drafty windows. These are places where people have died tragic deaths, where spirits refuse to leave, and where visitors report encounters so terrifying they'll never forget them. From coast to coast, these buildings stand as monuments to America's darkest history. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly why you should never visit them alone after midnight. But first, let me ask you something. Do you believe the dead can truly never rest? Let's find out together as we explore the 10 most haunted buildings in America. But I have to warn you, once you hear these stories, you might never look at old buildings the same way again. There are places where death came so frequently and in such overwhelming numbers that it left an indelible mark on the very foundations of the building. Waverly Hills Sanatorium is one such place. Built to heal the sick, it became a factory of death where over 60,000 people drew their final breath. And according to those brave enough to visit, many of those souls never truly left. From 1910 to 1961, Waverly Hills Sanatorium served as a tuberculosis hospital during one of the deadliest disease outbreaks in American history. Tuberculosis, known as the White Death, was claiming lives faster than doctors could treat patients. The sanatorium was built on a hill overlooking Louisville, Kentucky, where the clean air was believed to help patients recover. Instead, it became their final resting place. The numbers alone are staggering. During its 51 years of operation, an estimated 63,000 people died within the walls of Waverly Hills. That's more than 3 deaths per day, every day, for over 5 decades. But it wasn't just the quantity of death that makes Waverly Hills so haunted. It was the nature of those deaths. Tuberculosis was a horrific way to die. Patients would slowly waste away over months or years, coughing up blood, struggling for every breath. The disease attacked the lungs, but it also affected the brain, often causing hallucinations and delirium in the final stages. Many patients died alone, far from their families, in a state of confusion and terror. The medical treatments of the era were almost as horrific as the disease itself. Doctors performed experimental surgeries without anesthesia, removed ribs to collapse lungs, and inserted balloons into chest cavities. These primitive procedures often killed patients faster than the tuberculosis itself. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Waverly Hills was how the massive number of deaths was handled. To prevent panic among living patients, bodies were secretly transported through a tunnel system known as the death tunnel. This 500-foot underground passageway connected the hospital to the bottom of the hill, where hearses waited to collect the dead. The death tunnel processed so many bodies that staff developed an efficient system. Bodies were placed on a motorized rail system that carried them through the tunnel like cargo on a conveyor belt. During peak outbreak periods, the death tunnel processed dozens of bodies per day. But the tunnel system served another, more sinister purpose. When the tuberculosis epidemic finally ended and Waverly Hills closed in 1961, the building was converted into a geriatric facility. The same tunnels that had carried tuberculosis victims were now used to secretly dispose of elderly patients who died under suspicious circumstances. During its time as Woodhaven Geriatric Sanitarium, Waverly Hills gained a new reputation for patient abuse, neglect, and mysterious deaths. Allegations of electroshock therapy, physical abuse, and unauthorized medical experiments surfaced. The facility finally closed in 1982 amid multiple investigations and lawsuits. By the time Waverly Hills was abandoned, It had hosted death on an industrial scale for over 70 years. The building stood empty for decades, slowly deteriorating while the supernatural activity intensified. Today, Waverly Hills Sanatorium is considered one of the most haunted locations in America, and the paranormal activity here goes far beyond typical ghost sightings. This is a place where the supernatural presence is so overwhelming that it affects visitors on a physical and psychological level. The death tunnel itself is perhaps the most terrifying part of the facility. Visitors report feeling invisible hands grabbing at them as they walk through the 500-foot passageway. The temperature fluctuates wildly, sometimes dropping 30 degrees in a matter of seconds. Most disturbing of all, people report hearing the mechanical sounds of the old rail system still operating, carrying invisible cargo through the tunnel. But it's not just sounds. Visitors frequently report seeing shadow figures moving through the death tunnel, always in the same direction the bodies once traveled. These shadows appear to be carrying stretchers or gurneys, recreating the daily procession of death that occurred here for decades. Room 502, located on the top floor of the sanatorium, has become infamous as the most haunted room in the building. This was where a young nurse named Mary Hillenberg committed suicide in 1928 after learning she was pregnant and unmarried. She hanged herself in the room using a light fixture that's still there today. Visitors to room 502 report intense supernatural encounters. Some describe seeing the apparition of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, standing near the window with a rope around her neck. Others report feeling an overwhelming sense of despair that drives them to tears or causes panic attacks. The electromagnetic fields in room 502 are so unstable that electronic equipment frequently malfunctions or fails completely. But Mary Hillenberg isn't the only spirit that haunts room 502. Another nurse, who also worked on the same floor, jumped to her death from the room's window just a few years later. Visitors report seeing two distinct female figures in the room, both appearing to be in states of extreme distress. The most disturbing reports from room 502 come from visitors who claim they were pushed toward the window by invisible forces. Security guards have had to physically restrain people who suddenly became fixated on jumping from the same window where the nurses died. It's as if the suicidal despair that consumed the original victims continues to infect living visitors decades later. The children's ward on the third floor presents a different but equally chilling form of supernatural activity. Tuberculosis was particularly deadly to children, and hundreds of young patients died in this section of the hospital. Today, visitors report hearing children's voices singing, playing, and calling out for their parents who never came to take them home. But these aren't comforting sounds. The children's voices often carry tones of confusion, fear, and abandonment. Some visitors report being approached by invisible children who tug on their clothing or hold their hands. Others describe seeing small handprints appearing on dusty surfaces or windows, as if ghostly children are trying to get attention from the living adults who visit. The most heartbreaking encounters in the children's ward involve a spirit known as Mary. This young girl, believed to have died at age 7, appears to visitors as a sad child in a hospital gown who asks people to take her home. She's been spotted throughout the third floor, always alone, always asking the same question. When visitors try to approach her or respond to her request, she slowly fades away, leaving behind only the sound of quiet sobbing. The surgical suites on the fourth floor host some of the most violent supernatural activity in the building. This is where the experimental surgeries were performed, where patients endured unimaginable agony in desperate attempts to cure their disease. The operating tables are long gone, but visitors report seeing shadow figures strapped to invisible gurneys, writhing in apparent agony. More disturbing are the reports of hearing surgical procedures still taking place in these empty rooms. The sounds of metal instruments clinking together, muffled screams, and doctors giving orders in outdated medical terminology echo through the surgical wing. Some visitors report smelling the distinct odor of chloroform and disinfectant in rooms that haven't seen medical use in decades. One particularly documented case involves a paranormal investigator who was exploring the surgical wing alone when he began experiencing severe chest pain and difficulty breathing. As his condition worsened, he reported seeing a figure in outdated surgical attire approaching him with what appeared to be medical instruments. The investigator managed to call for help and was rushed to a hospital, where doctors found no medical explanation for his symptoms. The moment he left Waverly Hills, his breathing returned to normal and the chest pain disappeared. The main hallways of Waverly Hills present their own supernatural challenges. These corridors, which once buzzed with activity as staff and patients moved between rooms, are now home to shadow figures that seem to patrol the building. Visitors report seeing dark forms moving purposefully through the halls, always just at the edge of their vision. When they turn to look directly at these figures, they vanish, only to reappear moments later in their peripheral vision. But the shadow figures aren't just observers. They interact with visitors in ways that can be genuinely frightening. People report being followed through the hallways by unseen presences that mimic their footsteps. Others describe feeling invisible hands pushing them or trying to guide them toward specific rooms. Some visitors report being led to areas of the building they didn't intend to visit, as if the spirits are trying to show them something important. The basement of Waverly Hills houses the old kitchen, laundry, and maintenance areas, but it's also where some of the most malevolent supernatural activity occurs. Unlike the upper floors, where the spirits seem to be patients and staff who died of disease, the basement appears to host darker entities. Visitors report feeling an overwhelming sense of evil in these lower levels, along with temperatures that remain consistently 15 to 20 degrees colder than the rest of the building. The basement is where visitors most frequently report being physically attacked by supernatural forces. Scratches appear on people's skin with no visible cause. People are pushed down stairs or into walls by invisible hands. Some visitors report being grabbed by unseen entities that leave bruises in the shape of handprints on their arms and legs. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the basement is a presence that paranormal investigators have dubbed the Creeper. This entity appears as a tall, dark figure that moves in unnatural ways, sometimes crawling along walls and ceilings like an insect. The Creeper seems drawn to lone visitors, stalking them through the basement corridors before disappearing when they call for help or try to leave the area. What makes Waverly Hills particularly unique among haunted locations is the sheer scale of the supernatural activity. Most haunted buildings have hot spots of paranormal activity with quiet areas in between. Waverly Hills is different. The entire building pulses with supernatural energy, creating an environment where encountering spirits isn't just possible, but inevitable. The building's paranormal activity seems to follow patterns related to its history. The supernatural encounters are most intense during the evening and nighttime hours when most of the historical deaths occurred. The activity also appears to intensify during cold weather months, particularly in winter, when the tuberculosis outbreak was at its worst historically. But here's what will really send chills down your spine. Waverly Hills doesn't just house the spirits of people who died from tuberculosis. The building seems to have become a magnet for troubled souls from throughout the Louisville area. Paranormal investigators have documented encounters with spirits who appear to have no connection to the sanatorium's history, but seem drawn to the intense supernatural energy that permeates the building. This has led some researchers to theorize that Waverly Hills has become what they call a supernatural intersection, a place where the barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead has been permanently weakened by decades of death and suffering. If that's true, then visiting Waverly Hills isn't just about encountering the ghosts of tuberculosis patients. It's about stepping into a space where any spirit from any time period might manifest. The current owners of Waverly Hills offer paranormal tours and overnight investigations, but they require visitors to sign extensive waivers acknowledging the potential for intense supernatural encounters. They've documented hundreds of cases where visitors have experienced physical symptoms, emotional breakdowns, or supernatural phenomena that continue long after they leave the building. Some visitors report that their electronic devices continue to malfunction for weeks after visiting Waverly Hills. Others describe having vivid dreams about the sanatorium or feeling the presence of specific spirits they encountered during their visit. A few people claim to have developed sudden respiratory problems after visiting, as if they've somehow been infected with the same disease that killed so many patients within those walls. But the most disturbing reports come from visitors who claim that their experience at Waverly Hills changed them permanently. They describe feeling a constant presence following them, seeing shadow figures in their homes, or experiencing overwhelming feelings of sadness and despair that began during their visit and never completely went away. This raises a terrifying question. When you visit a place where 63,000 people died in agony and terror, do you risk bringing some of that supernatural energy home with you? Do the spirits of Waverly Hills sometimes attach themselves to living visitors, using them as a bridge to the outside world? That's a possibility that should make you think twice before booking a visit to the Sanatorium of the Damned. But if you thought Waverly Hills was scary, wait until you hear about our next location. Because sometimes the most haunted buildings are the ones where evil didn't just visit. It moved in and made itself at home. Step onto the wraparound porch of the Myrtles Plantation and you're entering one of America's most haunted homes, where the Spanish moss hanging from ancient oak trees isn't the only thing that refuses to let go of the past. This antebellum mansion has been called the most haunted house in America, and after you hear what happened within its walls, you'll understand why the dead refuse to leave. Built in 1796 by General David Bradford, the Myrtles Plantation sits on what many believe to be cursed ground. But it wasn't the land that was cursed. It was the evil that men chose to do upon it that stained this beautiful plantation with supernatural malevolence that persists to this day. The plantation's 600 acres were worked by enslaved people who endured unimaginable brutality and suffering. But the supernatural activity at the Myrtles isn't just about the general horrors of slavery. It's about specific acts of cruelty, betrayal, and murder that were so heinous they left permanent scars on the spiritual fabric of the property. The most famous ghost of the Myrtles plantation is Chloe, an enslaved woman whose story represents the intersection of powerlessness and revenge that defines so many Southern hauntings. According to legend, Chloe was forced to become the mistress of Clark Woodruff, who owned the plantation in the early 1800s. When Woodruff grew tired of her and threatened to send her to work in the fields, Chloe began eavesdropping on family conversations, hoping to learn information that would secure her position in the house. But Woodruff discovered her listening at doors and had her left ear cut off as punishment. Chloe was forced to wear a green turban to hide her disfigurement, and it's in this turban that her spirit is most often seen today. Desperate to regain her favored status, Chloe devised a plan that would backfire catastrophically. She decided to poison the Woodruff family just enough to make them sick, then nurse them back to health, proving her value to the household. But Chloe miscalculated the dose of oleander she mixed into a birthday cake, and instead of making them ill, she accidentally killed Clark Woodruff's wife and 2 daughters. The other enslaved people on the plantation, terrified of the collective punishment that would surely follow, took justice into their own hands. They dragged Chloe from her quarters and hanged her from one of the ancient oak trees that still stands on the property. Her body was then thrown into the Mississippi River. But Chloe's death didn't end her presence at the Myrtles plantation. Visitors and residents have been seeing Chloe's spirit for over 2 centuries. She appears as a young African-American woman wearing a green turban, often spotted walking through the house or standing on the veranda. But unlike many ghosts who seem unaware of living observers, Chloe appears to be very much aware of the present. She's been photographed numerous times, always in the same green turban, sometimes appearing solid enough to be mistaken for a living person. But Chloe doesn't just appear. She interacts with the physical world in ways that are impossible to ignore or explain away. Guests staying at the Myrtles Plantation, which now operates as a bed and breakfast, regularly report having their belongings moved or rearranged overnight. They wake up to find their clothes neatly folded when they left them scattered, or their suitcases unpacked and contents organized. It's as if Chloe is still trying to prove her worth as a house servant, caring for guests with the same desperate attention to detail that cost her life. Children seem to be particularly aware of Chloe's presence. Young visitors often report seeing a nice lady in a green hat who tucks them into bed at night or brings them water when they're thirsty. These children describe conversations with Chloe, saying she seems sad and asks about their families. It's only later that parents realize their children have been interacting with the plantation's most famous ghost. But Chloe isn't the only spirit that haunts the Myrtles Plantation. The house has hosted multiple generations of tragedy, and each traumatic event seems to have added another layer to the supernatural activity. The plantation's grand staircase is haunted by the ghost of a young girl, believed to be one of Clark Woodruff's daughters who died from Chloe's poisoned cake. Visitors frequently report seeing a child in a white dress playing on the stairs, bouncing a ball that makes no sound when it hits the steps. When approached, the little girl looks up with a smile before slowly fading away, leaving behind only the faint scent of birthday cake. But the most disturbing supernatural activity occurs in what is now called the murder room. This is where William Winter, a later owner of the plantation, was shot and killed in 1871. According to historical accounts, Winter was called to the front door by strangers who shot him on the porch. He managed to stagger back into the house and climbed the staircase, leaving bloody handprints on the wall as he tried to reach his bedroom. He collapsed and died on the 17th step. Today, visitors to the murder room report intense supernatural encounters. The bloody handprints that Winter left on the staircase wall have been painted over dozens of times, but they continue to bleed through each new coat of paint. Paranormal investigators have documented temperature drops of up to 25 degrees in this area, along with electromagnetic field readings that spike to levels their equipment can't measure. But the most chilling phenomenon in the murder room is the sound of footsteps climbing the staircase. Guests and staff regularly hear the heavy footsteps of a man struggling up the stairs, accompanied by labored breathing and occasional moans of pain. The footsteps always stop at the 17th step, followed by the sound of a body collapsing. Some visitors report actually seeing William Winter's ghostly reenactment of his final moments. He appears as a man in 1870s attire, clutching his chest as blood seeps through his shirt. He climbs the stairs with obvious difficulty, leaving actual bloody handprints on the wall that fade away within minutes. When he reaches the 17th step, he looks directly at observers with an expression of confusion and pain before collapsing and disappearing. The plantation's dining room hosts its own supernatural resident. A French woman, believed to have been murdered in the house during the 1800s, appears at the dining table during formal meals. She's described as an elegant woman in period dress who sits silently at the table, occasionally raising an invisible glass as if toasting other diners. Staff members report place settings moving on their own when she's present, and guests sometimes find an extra plate set at the table even though they didn't request it. But perhaps the most unsettling supernatural phenomenon at the Myrtles Plantation is the piano that plays by itself. The plantation's antique grand piano, which sits in the main parlor, regularly plays the same melody at exactly 3 a.m. The tune is always the same, a sad, slow melody that sounds like a funeral dirge. When investigators examine the piano during these nocturnal concerts, They find the keys moving on their own, depressing and releasing as if invisible fingers are playing the instrument. The plantation's mirrors are another source of supernatural activity, and this is where the hauntings take on a particularly sinister quality. Visitors regularly report seeing figures in the antique mirrors that aren't visible in the actual room. But unlike typical mirror apparitions, the figures at the Myrtles plantation often appear to be trying to communicate warnings or messages. One particular mirror, located in the main hallway, is said to trap the spirits of Sarah Woodruff and her children who died from Chloe's poisoning. Visitors report seeing handprints and face prints appearing on the mirror's surface from the inside, as if the spirits are pressing against the glass, trying to escape. These impressions appear even when the mirror has just been cleaned, and they're always the size of a woman's hands and children's faces. But the most disturbing mirror encounters involve visitors who report seeing their own reflections behaving independently. People describe looking into the plantation's antique mirrors and seeing their reflections moving differently or displaying expressions they're not making. Some visitors report their reflection appearing to mouth words they're not speaking, as if the mirror version of themselves is trying to warn them about something. The plantation's grounds are as haunted as the house itself. The ancient oak trees that shade the property are said to be gathering places for spirits, and visitors regularly report seeing figures standing beneath their branches. These outdoor apparitions often appear to be from different time periods, as if the trees serve as portals where past and present intersect. One particular oak tree, believed to be where Chloe was hanged, is a hotspot for supernatural activity. Visitors report seeing a rope hanging from its branches even though no rope is physically present. Others describe feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness when they stand beneath this tree, often accompanied by the sensation of invisible hands touching their necks. The plantation's slave quarters, though mostly ruins now, host some of the most emotionally intense supernatural encounters. Visitors report hearing voices singing work songs, children crying, and the sounds of daily life continuing in buildings that have been empty for over a century. These aren't just sounds, though. People describe smelling cooking food, with smoke, and other scents associated with the daily lives of enslaved people who once lived in these spaces. But what makes the supernatural activity at the Myrtles plantation particularly unsettling is how it seems to respond to the racial dynamics of visitors. African American visitors often report more intense encounters with the spirits of enslaved people, as if these ghosts recognize a kinship and are more willing to communicate. White visitors, particularly those from Southern families with plantation histories, sometimes report encounters that seem accusatory or hostile, as if the spirits are holding them accountable for historical injustices. The plantation now operates as a bed and breakfast, offering guests the opportunity to spend the night in one of America's most haunted homes. But the guest experience goes far beyond typical ghost sightings. Visitors regularly report having their sleep interrupted by supernatural encounters that continue throughout the night. Guests describe being awakened by the sounds of parties in empty rooms, complete with music, laughter, and conversation. When they investigate, they find the rooms empty but still warm, as if a crowd of people has just left. Others report being tucked into bed by invisible hands or finding their rooms cleaned and organized by unseen servants. But the most disturbing overnight experiences involve dreams that seem too real to be dreams. Guests report having vivid experiences where they witness historical events at the plantation, seeing slavery, violence, and death as if they were actually present. These aren't nightmares that fade upon waking. They're experiences that feel like memories, complete with sensory details that visitors couldn't possibly know. Some guests wake up with information about the plantation's history that they didn't know before their visit, information that later proves to be historically accurate. It's as if the spirits of the Myrtles plantation are using dreams to share their stories with living visitors, ensuring that their experiences aren't forgotten. The Myrtles Plantation represents a particular category of haunted location where the supernatural activity isn't just about individual ghosts, but about collective trauma that has soaked into the very foundations of the building. The spirits here aren't just residual energy from past events. They're active, aware entities that seem to be using their supernatural presence to bear witness to historical injustices and ensure that the truth about what happened at this plantation is never forgotten. But there's a darker possibility. What if the spirits at the Myrtles Plantation aren't just bearing witness to past evil? What if they're actively seeking justice for crimes that were never punished? What if the hauntings aren't just about remembering the past, but about settling scores that remain unresolved? That's a thought that should follow you into your next nightmare. But speaking of justice and unresolved crimes, our next haunted building will show you what happens when a place becomes so associated with death and violence that it transforms into something beyond just a haunted location. Sometimes buildings don't just house evil, they become evil. Imagine being locked in a building where screaming never stops, where the walls are stained with blood and human misery, and where the boundary between treatment and torture disappeared decades ago. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum isn't just one of America's most haunted buildings. It's a monument to institutionalized cruelty where the living were treated worse than animals, and where death was often the only escape. Built between 1858 and 1881, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was designed to house 250 patients using the revolutionary Kirkbride plan, which emphasized natural light, fresh air, and humane treatment for the mentally ill. The Gothic Revival architecture was meant to inspire hope and healing. Instead, it became a fortress of despair where over 2,400 people died in agony, neglect, and terror. But raw numbers don't capture the true horror of what happened within these walls. The asylum's tragedy wasn't just about death. It was about the systematic destruction of human dignity, the reduction of vulnerable people to less than animals, and the creation of suffering on an industrial scale. By the early 1900s, the asylum housed over 2,600 patients in a building designed for 250. Overcrowding led to conditions that can only be described as hell on earth. Patients were chained to walls, locked in cages, and subjected to experimental treatments that were indistinguishable from torture. Many were left naked in their own filth for months at a time. The most horrific treatments occurred in the asylum's medical wing. Lobotomies were performed with ice picks driven through patients' eye sockets. Insulin shock therapy induced seizures so violent they often resulted in broken bones and internal injuries. Hydrotherapy involved patients being strapped to tables while scalding or ice-cold water was poured over them for hours. But the most disturbing aspect of the asylum wasn't the experimental treatments. It was the complete abandonment of basic human decency. Patients who became too difficult to manage were simply forgotten, locked in basement rooms and left to die of starvation or exposure. Staff members routinely abused patients, knowing that no one would believe the testimony of people dismissed as insane. Children were not spared from this horror. The asylum housed mentally disabled children alongside violent criminals and severely psychotic adults. These children, some as young as 5 years old, were subjected to the same brutal treatments as adult patients. Many died from abuse, neglect, or suicide before reaching adulthood. The asylum finally closed in 1994 after decades of scandal, lawsuits, and investigations. But by then, the building had absorbed over a century of human suffering, and that anguish didn't disappear when the last patient was transferred to other facilities. Today, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum stands as one of the most supernaturally active locations in America. But unlike other haunted buildings where the paranormal activity might be subtle or sporadic, the supernatural presence here is overwhelming, aggressive, and often dangerous. The asylum's Ward F, which housed the most violent and disturbed patients, is where visitors encounter the most intense supernatural activity. This section of the building was designed as a maximum security area where patients were kept in isolation cells barely large enough for a human body. Today, these cells are empty, but visitors report that they're far from unoccupied. People who enter Ward F describe being overwhelmed by feelings of rage, despair, and terror that aren't their own. Many visitors experience sudden panic attacks or emotional breakdowns that seem to come from nowhere. Some report feeling invisible hands grabbing at them or pushing them against walls. The temperature in Ward F often drops 20 degrees below the rest of the building, even during summer months. But the most disturbing encounters in Ward F involve visitors who report being mentally attacked by the spirits of former patients. People describe having violent thoughts that aren't their own, sudden urges to harm themselves or others, and the sensation that their minds are being invaded by alien consciousnesses. Several visitors have had to be physically restrained or removed from the building after experiencing what can only be described as temporary possession. The asylum's medical wing hosts supernatural activity that's directly related to the horrific treatments that occurred there. Visitors report hearing the sounds of surgical procedures, including the distinctive noise of ice picks being hammered through skulls during lobotomy operations. Others describe smelling the combination of disinfectant and blood that would have permeated these areas during the asylum's operational years. But it's not just sounds and smells. Visitors frequently report seeing the ghostly reenactment of medical procedures, with transparent figures of doctors and nurses performing operations on invisible patients. These supernatural medical scenes always depict the most brutal treatments, and witnesses describe feeling physically ill while watching them. One particularly documented case involves a paranormal investigator who was exploring the medical wing when she began experiencing severe head pain. As the pain intensified, she reported seeing a figure in outdated medical attire approaching her with what appeared to be surgical instruments. Other investigators found her unconscious on the floor with 2 small puncture wounds above her eyes, exactly where ice pick lobotomies were performed. Medical examination found no physical cause for the wounds, which healed completely within 24 hours of her leaving the asylum. The children's ward presents perhaps the most heartbreaking supernatural activity in the building. This section housed mentally disabled children and adolescents, many of whom died from abuse or neglect. Today, visitors report encounters with child spirits who seem confused and frightened, still looking for parents who never came to take them home. But these aren't comforting encounters with innocent child spirits. The supernatural activity in the children's ward often involves feelings of overwhelming sadness and abandonment that affect visitors on a psychological level. People report having emotional breakdowns that last for hours after leaving the building. Some describe being followed home by a sense of childlike desperation that manifests in their own children becoming unusually clingy or fearful. The most disturbing reports from the children's ward involve visitors who claim to see the spirits of children who appear to be in various states of abuse or medical experimentation. These apparitions are so disturbing that the asylum's current owners have implemented protocols to support visitors who experience these encounters. The asylum's basement levels host the most malevolent supernatural activity in the building. This is where the most disturbed patients were kept, often in conditions that amounted to human storage rather than treatment. The basement was also where many patients died, either from the brutal conditions or from violence inflicted by other patients or staff. Today, the basement areas are considered dangerous for reasons that go beyond structural concerns. Visitors report being physically attacked by invisible forces, scratched by unseen hands, and pushed down stairs or into walls. Some describe encountering shadow figures that seem to emanate pure malevolence, entities that appear to take pleasure in frightening or harming living visitors. But the most terrifying supernatural phenomenon in the basement is what paranormal investigators have dubbed the screaming room. This small chamber, believed to have been used for solitary confinement, produces sounds that have no natural explanation. Visitors report hearing screaming so intense and prolonged that it causes physical pain to listen to it. The screaming seems to come from multiple sources simultaneously, as if dozens of people are crying out in agony at the same time. What makes the screaming room particularly disturbing is that the supernatural vocalization appears to respond to living visitors. The screaming intensifies when people enter the room and often seems to follow them as they try to leave. Some visitors report that the screaming continues in their minds for hours after leaving the asylum, as if the sounds have somehow embedded themselves in their consciousness. The asylum's common areas host supernatural activity that reflects the daily horror that patients experienced during the building's operational years. Visitors report seeing large groups of ghostly patients shuffling through hallways, often appearing malnourished and wearing hospital gowns that are torn or soiled. These group apparitions seem to be recreating the daily routines of asylum life, moving from room to room in patterns that have no relevance to the current building layout. But unlike other locations where group apparitions seem unaware of living observers, the ghostly patients at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum often interact with visitors. People report being approached by individual spirits who seem to mistake them for doctors, nurses, or family members. These interactions can be particularly disturbing because the spirits often ask for help, medication, or to be released from the asylum. One of the most documented supernatural phenomena at the asylum involves a spirit known as Ruth. This former patient appears to visitors as an elderly woman in a hospital gown who approaches people with outstretched hands, begging to be taken home. Ruth's spirit is so consistently reported that she's become something of a mascot for the asylum's paranormal activity. But encounters with Ruth often leave visitors feeling emotionally drained and deeply disturbed by her obvious desperation and confusion. The asylum's recreational areas tell their own supernatural stories. The gymnasium, where patients were occasionally allowed supervised exercise, is now home to the sounds of activities that continue without any living participants. Visitors report hearing basketballs bouncing, people running across the wooden floor, and what sounds like organized games or group activities. When they investigate, they find the gymnasium empty but still echoing with the sounds of invisible recreation. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum's paranormal activity is how it seems to affect visitors' mental state long after they leave the building. People who spend time in the asylum frequently report experiencing nightmares, depression, and anxiety that begin during their visit and continue for weeks or months afterward. Some visitors describe having intrusive thoughts about self-harm or violence that are completely out of character for them. Others report feeling watched or followed by an invisible presence that seems to have attached itself to them during their visit to the asylum. A few people claim to have developed temporary symptoms of mental illness after visiting, as if they've somehow absorbed the psychological anguish that permeates the building. This has led some paranormal researchers to theorize that the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum doesn't just house the spirits of former patients. The building itself has become a kind of supernatural infection that can affect the mental health of living visitors. If that's true, then visiting the asylum isn't just about encountering ghosts. It's about risking psychological contamination from decades of accumulated madness and suffering. The asylum offers guided tours and overnight paranormal investigations, but they require visitors to sign extensive medical and psychological waivers. They've documented numerous cases of people having mental health crises during or after visits, and they maintain relationships with local mental health professionals to assist visitors who experience serious psychological effects. But here's what should really terrify you about the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Unlike other haunted locations where the supernatural activity seems to be echoes of past events, the paranormal phenomena here appear to be actively growing stronger and more aggressive. Visitors from different time periods report increasingly intense encounters, as if the building's supernatural energy is feeding on itself and becoming more powerful with each passing year. If that's true, then the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum isn't just a haunted building. It's a supernatural organism that continues to grow and evolve, becoming more dangerous to living visitors as it absorbs more psychic energy from their fear and trauma. That possibility should make you think very carefully before visiting this asylum of the damned. But if you thought the systematic torture of mental patients was horrific, wait until you hear about our next haunted building. Because sometimes the most evil places are the ones that pretended to be sanctuaries. In the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter stands a 3-story mansion that represents the absolute worst of human evil. The LaLaurie mansion isn't just haunted by ordinary spirits. It's possessed by the tortured souls of people who endured unimaginable cruelty at the hands of one of America's most sadistic serial killers. And unlike other haunted locations where the supernatural activity might be seeking peace or justice, the entities here seem consumed by a rage so intense it transforms visitors into victims. Built in 1832, the mansion at 1140 Royal Street was the elegant home of Dr. Louis LaLaurie and his wife, Delphine. To New Orleans society, Delphine LaLaurie was the epitome of Southern refinement. She hosted lavish parties, contributed to charitable causes, and presented herself as a cultured lady of impeccable breeding. But behind the mansion's beautiful facade, Delphine LaLaurie was conducting a reign of terror that would make the most sadistic torturer seem merciful by comparison. The truth about what happened in the LaLaurie mansion came to light on April 10, 1834, when a fire broke out in the kitchen. When firefighters and neighbors rushed to help extinguish the blaze, they discovered that the fire had been set deliberately by an enslaved cook who was chained to the stove and preferred to burn to death rather than endure another day of Delphine LaLaurie's torture. But the fire was just the beginning of the horror that would be uncovered that day. When rescuers broke down the door to the mansion's attic, they discovered a scene that traumatized hardened New Orleans residents who had seen plenty of violence and brutality. The attic had been converted into a torture chamber where Delphine LaLaurie had been conducting medical experiments on enslaved people that went far beyond anything justified by the perverted science of the era. 7 enslaved people were found chained to makeshift operating tables, all in various stages of surgical experimentation. Some had limbs removed and reattached in different positions. Others had holes drilled in their skulls with maggots crawling in the wounds. One woman had her limbs broken and reset at impossible angles, leaving her permanently twisted into an inhuman shape. But the living victims were not the most horrific discovery. The mansion's floors, walls, and attic space contained the remains of an estimated 100 people who had died during Delphine LaLaurie's experiments. Bodies were found dismembered, partially decomposed, and arranged in ways that suggested they had been used for ongoing study after death. The crowd that gathered outside the mansion that day was so enraged by what they discovered that they would have torn Delphine LaLaurie apart with their bare hands. But she escaped in her carriage and fled to France, where she lived comfortably on family money until her death in 1849, never facing justice for her crimes. The mansion stood empty for years after the LaLaurie family's escape, but neighbors quickly realized that Delphine's departure hadn't ended the supernatural activity that had begun during her residence. In fact, it seemed to intensify after she left, as if the spirits of her victims were finally free to express their rage without fear of further torture. Today, the LaLaurie Mansion is considered one of the most dangerous paranormally active locations in America. Unlike other haunted buildings where the paranormal activity might be seeking peace or justice, the supernatural presence here is intelligent, aggressive, and seems focused on inflicting the same kind of suffering on living visitors that the original victims experienced. The mansion's attic, where the worst torture occurred, is where visitors encounter the most violent supernatural activity. People who enter this space report being physically attacked by invisible entities with a level of violence that goes far beyond typical ghostly encounters. Visitors have been scratched, bitten, and pushed downstairs by forces they cannot see. But the attacks aren't random or chaotic. They seem deliberately designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma on visitors. People report being grabbed by invisible hands that leave bruises in the exact shape of human fingerprints. Others describe feeling surgical instruments touching their skin, or the sensation of restraints being tightened around their wrists and ankles. The most disturbing reports from the attic involve visitors who claim to experience the torture methods that were used on the original victims. People describe sudden, excruciating pain in their limbs, as if invisible surgeons are operating on them without anesthesia. Some report the sensation of having holes drilled in their skulls, or feeling their bones being broken and reset. These experiences aren't just psychological. Visitors frequently leave the mansion with unexplained injuries that match the types of wounds found on LaLaurie's victims. Scratch marks appear in surgical patterns, bruises form in the shape of restraint devices, and some people develop temporary paralysis in limbs that corresponds to the amputation experiments performed in the attic. The mansion's lower floors host supernatural activity that reflects the daily horror experienced by enslaved people who lived and worked under Delphine LaLaurie's roof. Visitors report seeing apparitions of people in chains, always bearing visible wounds and signs of torture. These spirits don't just appear and disappear. They interact with living visitors, often seeming to mistake them for their historical tormentor. Some visitors report being approached by ghostly figures who beg for medical attention or plead not to be taken back to the attic. These encounters are so emotionally intense that people often require counseling after experiencing them. The spirits seem trapped in their final moments of terror, unable to move beyond the trauma that ended their lives. But the most chilling supernatural phenomenon in the LaLaurie mansion is the recreation of torture sessions. Visitors and paranormal investigators have documented encounters where they witness full reenactments of the medical experiments, complete with the sounds of victims screaming, surgical instruments being used, and Delphine LaLaurie's voice giving instructions to unseen assistants. These supernatural reenactments aren't just visual or auditory. People report smelling the combination of blood, antiseptic, and decomposition that would have permeated the mansion during its use as a torture chamber. Some describe feeling the heat of surgical lamps on their skin, or the sensation of being watched by multiple unseen observers as if they're the subject of the experiments. The mansion's kitchen area, where the enslaved cook set the fire that exposed LaLaurie's crimes, hosts its own supernatural activity. Visitors report seeing the apparition of a woman surrounded by flames, always looking toward the staircase that leads to the attic. This spirit seems to be eternally trying to warn people about what lies upstairs, gesturing frantically toward the upper floors before disappearing. But what makes the LaLaurie mansion particularly dangerous is how the supernatural activity affects visitors long after they leave the building. People who tour the mansion frequently report that the paranormal experiences follow them home, continuing for weeks or months after their visit. Visitors describe having nightmares that feel like memories of being tortured in the mansion's attic. Others report developing inexplicable fears of medical procedures or feeling watched by invisible entities in their own homes. Some people claim to have developed chronic pain conditions that began during their visit to the mansion and never completely resolved. Most disturbing are the reports from visitors who claim that their personalities changed after touring the LaLaurie mansion. People describe becoming more aggressive, developing sadistic thoughts, or experiencing urges to harm others that are completely out of character. It's as if exposure to the mansion's supernatural energy somehow infected them with the same malevolence that possessed Delphine LaLaurie. This has led some paranormal researchers to theorize that the LaLaurie mansion doesn't just house the spirits of torture victims. The building itself has been transformed into a supernatural entity that feeds on human suffering and actively seeks to create more trauma. If that's true, then visiting the mansion isn't just about encountering ghosts. It's about risking psychological and spiritual contamination from one of the most evil locations in American history. The mansion is currently a private residence, and the owners don't allow public tours. But the building's exterior is a stop on numerous New Orleans ghost tours, and even standing outside the building is enough to trigger supernatural encounters for many visitors. People report feeling watched from the windows, experiencing sudden temperature drops, and hearing sounds of distress coming from inside the building. Local paranormal investigators have documented electromagnetic field readings around the mansion that are unlike anything found at other haunted locations. The readings suggest a level of supernatural activity so intense that it affects the physical environment for blocks around the building. Some researchers believe the mansion has become what they call a supernatural reactor, generating paranormal energy that spreads throughout the surrounding area. But here's what should terrify you most about the LaLaurie mansion. Unlike other haunted locations where the supernatural activity seems to be decreasing over time, the paranormal phenomena here appears to be growing stronger. Visitors from different decades report increasingly intense encounters, as if the spirit's rage is building rather than dissipating with time. If that's true, then the LaLaurie mansion isn't just a haunted building. It's a supernatural time bomb where the accumulated anguish and rage of torture victims is reaching critical mass. And when that spiritual energy finally explodes, it might not be contained within the mansion's walls. That possibility should keep you awake tonight. But if you thought the LaLaurie mansion represented the worst of supernatural evil, you haven't heard our ninth story yet. Because sometimes the most haunted buildings are the ones where evil didn't just visit once. Sometimes, evil finds a location so perfectly suited to its purposes that it never leaves. Imagine a building so imposing and terrifying that Hollywood uses it to represent the very concept of imprisonment and despair. The Ohio State Reformatory, also known as Mansfield Reformatory, served as the filming location for The Shawshank Redemption. But the real horror that occurred within its walls makes any fictional prison story seem tame by comparison. This isn't just a haunted building. It's a monument to the systematic destruction of human hope, where despair became so concentrated that it continues to poison everyone who enters. Built between 1886 and 1910, the Ohio State Reformatory was designed using the Auburn system of penology, which emphasized silence, isolation, and absolute obedience. The architecture itself was meant to intimidate, with massive stone walls, towering cell blocks, and cathedral-like spaces that dwarfed human occupants. But the psychological impact of the building's design was just the beginning of the horror that would unfold within its walls. The reformatory housed over 154,000 inmates during its 94 years of operation, from 1896 to 1990. But unlike other prisons that focused on punishment or rehabilitation, the Ohio State Reformatory became something more sinister, a place where human beings were systematically broken down until death became preferable to continued existence. The prison's cell blocks were designed to house 1,200 inmates, but during peak periods, over 3,300 men were crammed into spaces barely large enough for half that number. Cells meant for one person held 3 or 4 inmates, creating conditions that drove men insane within months of their arrival. The overcrowding led to violence, disease, and suicide rates that were among the highest in the American prison system. But the physical conditions were just one aspect of the reformatory's horror. The prison operated under a culture of brutality where guards routinely beat inmates to death, and sadistic wardens implemented punishment systems that amounted to torture. Solitary confinement cells were so small that inmates couldn't lie down, and men were kept in these spaces for months or years at a time. The most horrific punishments occurred in the reformatory's basement, in areas that inmates called the hole. These underground cells were little more than stone boxes where inmates were kept in complete darkness, often standing in their own waste for weeks at a time. Many men died in the hole, either from the physical conditions or from suicide brought on by complete psychological breakdown. The reformatory's hospital was another site of institutional horror. Medical care was minimal, and inmates with mental illnesses were subjected to experimental treatments that included lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and drug experiments. Many inmates who entered the hospital died not from their original ailments but from the treatments they received. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Ohio State Reformatory was how it seemed to corrupt everyone who worked there. Guards who started as decent men gradually became sadistic torturers. Wardens implemented increasingly brutal policies that served no purpose except to inflict maximum suffering. The building itself seemed to transform people into monsters. The reformatory finally closed in 1990 amid lawsuits, investigations, and public outrage over conditions that were deemed unconstitutional. By then, an estimated 200 inmates had died by suicide, thousands more had died from violence or medical neglect, and the psychological damage inflicted on those who survived was incalculable. Today, the Ohio State Reformatory stands as one of America's most intensely haunted locations, but the supernatural activity here is different from other haunted prisons. The spirits aren't just individual ghosts of people who died within the walls. The building seems to house a collective consciousness of despair so intense that it affects visitors on a fundamental psychological level. The reformatory's cell blocks are where visitors encounter the most overwhelming supernatural activity. People report feeling crushed by an invisible weight the moment they enter these areas, as if the concentrated despair of thousands of inmates is pressing down on them physically. The temperature in the cell blocks often drops 20 to 30 degrees below the outside temperature, even during summer months. But the most disturbing phenomenon in the cell blocks is what paranormal investigators call psychic bleeding. Visitors report experiencing emotions that aren't their own. Overwhelming hopelessness, rage, and despair that drive them to tears or panic attacks. Some people describe feeling suicidal thoughts that begin the moment they enter the cell areas and disappear the moment they leave. Individual cells host their own supernatural residents. Visitors frequently report seeing inmates in their cells, usually sitting on bunks or standing at cell doors with expressions of complete despair. These apparitions seem unaware of modern visitors, as if they're still serving their sentences in a reality that exists parallel to our own. But some cell spirits are very aware of living visitors. People report being approached by ghostly inmates who seem to mistake them for guards, family members, or other prisoners. These interactions often involve desperate pleas for release, medical attention, or simply human contact. The emotional intensity of these encounters often leaves visitors traumatized for days or weeks afterward. The reformatory's solitary confinement area hosts the most violent supernatural activity in the building. Visitors to these cells report being physically attacked by invisible entities that seem to be reenacting the violence they experienced in life. People have been pushed, scratched, and even temporarily locked inside cells by forces they cannot see or explain. But the attacks aren't random. They seem designed to give visitors a taste of what inmates experienced during their confinement. People report feeling claustrophobic panic even in open spaces, as if invisible walls are closing in around them. Others describe the sensation of being watched by multiple unseen entities, creating the same paranoid terror that drove many historical inmates to suicide. The most documented case of violent supernatural activity occurred in solitary confinement cell 13, where a particularly brutal inmate named Richard Daniel was murdered by guards in 1932. Visitors to this cell regularly report being grabbed by invisible hands, having their breathing restricted, and experiencing the sensation of being beaten by unseen assailants. The reformatory's administrative areas host supernatural activity that reflects the institutional corruption that characterized the prison's operation. Visitors report seeing apparitions of guards and officials in period uniforms, usually engaged in activities that suggest ongoing cruelty or neglect. These ghostly authority figures seem to be eternally carrying out the same brutal policies that define the reformatory's culture. The warden's quarters, located within the prison complex, tell their own supernatural story. Multiple wardens and their families lived in these quarters during the reformatory's operation, and several died under mysterious circumstances. Today, visitors report encountering the spirits of warden families, particularly children who seem to be confused about why they're living in such a frightening place. But the most chilling supernatural phenomenon in the warden's quarters involves the spirit of Helen Glatka, the wife of Warden Arthur Glatka, who died in 1950 from injuries sustained when a gun accidentally discharged in the family quarters. Her spirit appears to visitors as a woman in 1940s clothing, often holding what appears to be a firearm and looking confused or distressed. The reformatory's chapel areas host supernatural activity that reflects the religious desperation that many inmates experienced during their confinement. Visitors report hearing ghostly church services, including singing, preaching, and prayers that seem to come from large congregations of invisible participants. These supernatural religious services often focus on themes of forgiveness, redemption, and escape from suffering. But what makes the Ohio State Reformatory particularly terrifying is how the supernatural activity seems to feed off visitor emotions. People who enter the building feeling confident or curious often leave feeling depressed, anxious, or emotionally drained. The building seems to absorb positive energy while amplifying negative emotions, creating a supernatural environment that becomes more oppressive the longer visitors remain. The reformatory now offers public tours and paranormal investigations, but they require extensive safety briefings and psychological preparation for visitors. The building's supernatural activity is so intense that people regularly experience emotional breakdowns, panic attacks, and physical symptoms that require medical attention. But the most disturbing aspect of visiting the Ohio State Reformatory is how the experience affects people long after they leave. Visitors frequently report that their mental health deteriorates following their visit, with many developing depression, anxiety, or sleep disorders that begin during their time in the building and persist for months afterward. Some visitors report having recurring nightmares about being imprisoned in the reformatory, complete with sensory details they couldn't have known from their brief visit. Others describe feeling followed by an invisible presence that seems to be trying to drag them back to the prison. A few people claim to have developed claustrophobia or other phobias that began during their visit and never completely resolved. This has led paranormal researchers to theorize that the Ohio State Reformatory has become what they call a despair generator, a location where decades of concentrated human suffering have created a supernatural environment that actively damages the mental health of anyone who enters. If that's true, then visiting the reformatory isn't just about encountering ghosts. It's about risking psychological contamination from one of the most emotionally toxic environments in America. But here's what should terrify you most about the Ohio State Reformatory. Unlike other haunted locations where the supernatural activity seems tied to specific historical events, the paranormal phenomena here appears to be growing stronger and more aggressive over time. Visitors from different decades report increasingly intense encounters, as if the building's supernatural energy is feeding on itself and becoming more dangerous with each passing year. If the reformatory truly has become a despair generator, then it's not just a haunted building. It's a supernatural weapon that continues to inflict psychological damage on anyone who enters, perpetuating the same culture of cruelty and hopelessness that defined its operational years. That possibility should haunt your dreams tonight. But we have one more location to explore, and this final haunted building will challenge everything you thought you knew about the relationship between evil and architecture. Because our last stop isn't just haunted by the dead. It's possessed by something that was never human at all. Deep in the Colorado Rockies, perched on a hill overlooking the town of Estes Park, sits a grand white hotel that has welcomed guests for over a century. But the Stanley Hotel doesn't just host the living. It's become a permanent residence for spirits who refuse to check out. Built in 1909 by inventor F.O. Stanley, this 420-room Georgian colonial revival hotel was meant to be a luxurious mountain retreat. Stanley himself suffered from tuberculosis and believed the clean mountain air would cure his ailment. Little did he know he was building what would become one of America's most supernatural destinations. The hotel's haunted reputation began almost immediately after opening. Staff members reported strange occurrences in the early years. Guests would complain about phantom piano music drifting through the halls at night. Elevators would operate on their own, stopping at floors where no one had pressed the call button. Children's laughter echoed through empty corridors. But the Stanley Hotel truly cemented its place in horror history when author Stephen King stayed in room 217 in September 1974. The hotel was nearly empty, preparing to close for the winter season. King and his wife were among the last guests, wandering the eerily quiet halls. That night, King had a nightmare about his young son being chased through the hotel's maze-like corridors by malevolent forces. He woke up in a cold sweat, grabbed a pen, and began writing what would become The Shining. Now here's where it gets really interesting. King may have been inspired by the Stanley, but the supernatural activity at the hotel is very real. Room 217, where King stayed, remains the most requested room despite its terrifying reputation. Guests report unpacked suitcases being mysteriously repacked. Personal belongings move from one location to another overnight. The bathroom light turns on and off by itself. Some visitors wake up to find the impression of someone sitting on the edge of their bed. But room 217 isn't the only supernatural hotspot. The fourth floor is particularly active, with guests reporting the sounds of children running up and down the hallways at all hours of the night. The sounds are so realistic that security guards regularly check the area, only to find the corridors completely empty. The concert hall hosts its own resident spirit. F.O. Stanley himself appears to still enjoy the entertainment, with staff and guests spotting his apparition in the audience during performances. He's described as a distinguished gentleman in period clothing, applauding politely before vanishing into thin air. Perhaps most unsettling is the hotel's main staircase. Guests frequently report feeling an invisible presence walking beside them as they climb or descend the steps. Some describe a cold hand touching their shoulder or the sensation of someone breathing on their neck. Security cameras have captured orbs of light floating up and down the staircase when no one else is present. The hotel's ballroom tells its own ghostly tale. During renovations in the 1980s, workers reported tools moving on their own and the sound of a full orchestra playing when the room was completely empty. The ghostly music always stops the moment someone enters the ballroom, leaving only an eerie silence behind. What makes the Stanley Hotel particularly chilling is how the supernatural activity seems to intensify during the winter months when the hotel is less crowded. It's as if the spirits become more active when they have fewer living guests to share the space with. Staff members who work the night shift during these quieter periods report the most intense encounters. One particularly bone-chilling account comes from a maintenance worker who was fixing a radiator on the fourth floor during a snowy February night. As he worked alone in the hallway, he began hearing what sounded like a party in full swing coming from one of the rooms. Laughter, conversation, clinking glasses, music. But when he checked the guest registry, that entire section of the floor was unoccupied. When he pressed his ear to the door of the room where the sounds seemed loudest, everything went completely silent. The moment he stepped away, the party sounds resumed. But here's what will really send chills down your spine. The Stanley Hotel doesn't just host random spirits. Many of the ghosts are believed to be former guests who loved the hotel so much in life that they chose to stay forever in death. They're not malevolent or trying to harm anyone. They simply can't bear to leave this beautiful mountain retreat. That thought should comfort you, right? Wrong. Because if you've ever wondered what it would be like to share a hotel with permanent residents who happen to be dead, the Stanley Hotel offers you that exact experience. And trust me, when you're lying in bed at 3 a.m. and you hear footsteps in the hallway outside your room, knowing they belong to someone who died decades ago doesn't make them any less terrifying. The question isn't whether the Stanley Hotel is haunted. The question is whether you're brave enough to spend a night there and find out just how haunted it really is. But before you book that room, you need to hear about our next location. Because if you think a haunted hotel is scary, wait until you discover what lurks in America's most notorious prison. Imagine being locked in complete darkness and total silence for years. No human contact, no sounds from the outside world. Just you, for stone walls, and your slowly deteriorating mind. This was the reality for thousands of prisoners at Eastern State Penitentiary, and many believe their tormented souls never left. Built in 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary wasn't just another prison. It was a revolutionary experiment in criminal rehabilitation that turned into a nightmare of human suffering. The prison introduced the world to solitary confinement as a form of rehabilitation, believing that isolation would force criminals to reflect on their sins and emerge as reformed individuals. The reality was far more sinister. Prisoners were kept in individual cells measuring just 8 by 12 feet. They had no contact with other inmates, no visitors, no books, no work to occupy their minds. When they left their cells for their daily hour of exercise, they were forced to wear hoods so they couldn't see or be seen by others. The only human contact they received was from guards who spoke to them only when absolutely necessary. This system, called the Pennsylvania system, was praised by reformers worldwide. But what those reformers didn't realize was that they had created a factory for producing insanity, despair, and death. Within the first few years of operation, the suicide rate at Eastern State was alarming. Prisoners went insane at unprecedented rates. Some became catatonic, staring at walls for hours without moving. Others developed what we would now recognize as severe mental illnesses. Many died not from disease or violence, but from what can only be described as broken spirits. The prison operated for 142 years, housing over 75,000 inmates during its lifetime. Notable prisoners included bank robber Willie Sutton and infamous gangster Al Capone, who spent 8 months there in 1929. But it's not the famous inmates who haunt Eastern State today. It's the forgotten souls who suffered and died in anonymity within these walls. Paranormal investigators consider Eastern State Penitentiary one of the most haunted locations in America, and for good reason. The supernatural activity here isn't subtle. It's aggressive, overwhelming, and absolutely terrifying. Cell Block 6 is particularly active. Visitors report seeing shadow figures moving between cells. The temperature drops dramatically in certain areas for no apparent reason. Electromagnetic field detectors go haywire, registering massive spikes in energy that have no natural explanation. Most unsettling of all, people report hearing voices calling out from empty cells, pleading for help or simply repeating the same phrases over and over again. But here's what makes Eastern State truly unique among haunted locations. The spirits here don't just make their presence known through subtle signs. They interact with visitors in ways that are impossible to ignore or explain away. During a paranormal investigation in Cell Block 15, a team of researchers brought recording equipment to capture electronic voice phenomena. What they captured instead was far more disturbing. Clear, audible voices speaking directly to them, answering their questions in real time. One voice, believed to belong to a prisoner who died in the 1940s, provided specific details about his life and death that were later verified through prison records. The prison's hospital wing tells perhaps the most heartbreaking supernatural story. This is where prisoners were brought when the psychological torture of solitary confinement finally broke them completely. Many died here, not from physical ailments, but from what can only be described as terminal despair. Today, visitors to the hospital wing report feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness that brings them to tears without warning. Some describe feeling invisible hands touching them, as if the spirits are reaching out for human comfort they were denied in life. Others report seeing full-body apparitions of prisoners in their striped uniforms, wandering the halls with vacant expressions. But the most chilling encounters happen in the punishment cells. These tiny spaces, smaller than closets, were used to discipline prisoners who violated the already strict rules. Inmates could be locked in these spaces for weeks or months with minimal food and water. Many died in these cells, and their presence is still felt today. Visitors who enter these punishment areas frequently experience panic attacks, claustrophobia, and the sensation of being watched by multiple unseen entities. Some report feeling phantom hands grabbing at them, trying to pull them deeper into the cells. The temperature in these areas often drops 20 degrees or more below the surrounding environment, even during hot summer days. One of the most documented supernatural phenomena at Eastern State is known as the shadow figure of Cell Block 4. This dark entity appears to be the silhouette of a tall man who moves along the corridor, stopping at each cell as if conducting some eternal inspection. Unlike other spirits at the prison who seem to be replaying moments from their lives, this shadow figure appears to be aware of visitors and will often stop and turn toward them before disappearing. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Eastern State's paranormal activity is how it affects people long after they leave. Visitors frequently report nightmares for weeks following their visit. Some describe feeling followed by an invisible presence that follows them home. A few have reported their electronic devices malfunctioning for days after visiting the prison, as if some supernatural energy attached itself to them. Now, you might be thinking that all of this can be explained by the power of suggestion or the creepy atmosphere of an old prison. But here's the thing that will really make your skin crawl. Eastern State Penitentiary doesn't just have a reputation for being haunted among ghost hunters and thrill seekers. The supernatural activity here is so well documented and consistent that it's attracted the attention of serious researchers, historians, and even skeptical scientists who have come to study the phenomena and left as believers. The prison offers ghost tours year-round, but they warn visitors that the supernatural activity is unpredictable and can be intense. They've had to implement safety protocols because people regularly faint, have panic attacks, or simply run out of the building in terror. So why do the spirits of Eastern State Penitentiary remain trapped within these walls? Some paranormal experts believe it's because the suffering here was so intense and prolonged that it literally imprinted itself on the physical structure of the building. The stones themselves seem to hold memories of the anguish that occurred here. Others believe the spirits remain because they're still serving their sentences, trapped in an eternal cycle of punishment and isolation. They can't leave because, in their tormented minds, they haven't paid their debt to society. But there's a third theory that's even more disturbing. What if the spirits of Eastern State Penitentiary don't want to leave? What if decades of solitary confinement conditioned them to fear the outside world so much that death itself couldn't make them abandon the only home they knew? That's a thought that should keep you awake tonight. But don't dwell on it too long, because our next haunted building has a very different kind of supernatural presence. One that doesn't just want to scare you, one that wants to take you home with it forever. What would you do if you believed that the vengeful spirits of everyone killed by your family's invention were hunting you? Would you hide? Would you flee the country? Or would you do what Sarah Winchester did and build them a house so confusing and maze-like that they could never find you? For 38 years, Sarah Winchester never stopped building. Day and night, 7 days a week, construction continued on her Victorian mansion in San Jose, California. The result is a 160-room architectural nightmare that defies logic, physics, and sanity. And according to those who visit, it's still occupied by the very spirits Sarah was trying to confuse. Sarah Winchester was the widow of William Wirt Winchester, heir to the Winchester rifle fortune. When her husband died in 1881, Sarah inherited $20 million and a 50% stake in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. She also inherited something else: a crushing guilt over the thousands of people killed by Winchester rifles and a growing belief that their spirits were coming for her. Whether driven by grief, guilt, or genuine supernatural encounters, Sarah became convinced that she was cursed. A Boston medium allegedly told her that the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles were seeking revenge against her family, and the only way to appease them was to move west and build a house for them. But there was one condition: construction could never stop. If the building ever ceased, the spirits would finally be able to claim her. So Sarah moved to California and began the most bizarre construction project in American history. The Winchester Mystery House, as it came to be known, is an architectural impossibility. Staircases lead to ceilings. Doors open onto walls. Hallways end abruptly. There are rooms within rooms, secret passages behind bookcases, and corridors that loop back on themselves. Some staircases have steps only 2 inches high, designed for Sarah's arthritis but creating an eerie, dreamlike quality when you walk them. But the house's confusing layout was just the beginning. Sarah built 40 bedrooms, most of which she never slept in. She installed 47 fireplaces and 47 stairways. The number 13 appears throughout the house obsessively. Windows have 13 panes, walls have 13 panels, chandeliers have 13 lights, and many rooms have 13 windows or 13 doors. Was this numerology meant to ward off evil spirits? Or was Sarah's deteriorating mental state expressing itself through compulsive building? The construction workers who built the house reported strange occurrences from the very beginning. Tools would disappear and reappear in different locations. They would arrive at work to find that progress from the previous day had been mysteriously undone overnight, as if invisible hands were rearranging their work. Some claimed to hear voices giving them construction directions that contradicted Sarah's plans. Sarah herself lived in just a few rooms of the massive house, moving between them according to a pattern known only to her. She held seances nightly in the Blue Room, a specially designed chamber where she claimed to communicate with friendly spirits who advised her on the house's construction. These sessions would last for hours, with servants reporting that they could hear Sarah's voice along with other voices responding to her. The house claimed its first victim during construction. A worker fell 3 stories to his death while installing a window. His body was found in what is now called the Witch's Cap, a 7-story tower that Sarah had built for unknown purposes. Some say his death was an accident. Others believe the hostile spirits had claimed their first victim as a warning to Sarah. But the most chilling death occurred on September 5, 1922, when Sarah Winchester herself died in her sleep in the house at age 82. Construction stopped immediately, and according to legend, that's when the real haunting began. Today, visitors to the Winchester Mystery House report encounters that go far beyond typical ghost sightings. This isn't a place where you might hear unexplained footsteps or catch glimpses of shadowy figures. The supernatural activity here is interactive, intelligent, and often terrifying. The most commonly reported phenomenon is the sound of construction work continuing throughout the night. Visitors and tour guides hear hammering, sawing, and the sounds of heavy materials being moved around. When they investigate, they find no source for the sounds. It's as if the ghostly construction crew that Sarah employed in life is still following her orders in death. But it's the Blue Room where the most intense supernatural activity occurs. This is where Sarah held her nightly seances, and visitors today report that the sessions never ended. People entering the room often hear multiple voices engaged in conversation, always stopping the moment a living person enters. The temperature in the Blue Room fluctuates wildly, sometimes dropping 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Some visitors report seeing Sarah Winchester herself, still conducting her nightly communication with the spirit world. She appears as an elderly woman in Victorian dress, seated at the small table she used for her seances. Witnesses describe her lips moving as if in conversation, but they can never make out the words. When she becomes aware of being watched, she slowly turns toward the observer and fades away. The staircase that leads nowhere has become a hotspot for supernatural encounters. Visitors frequently report feeling invisible hands pushing them as they climb these steps, as if something is trying to prevent them from reaching the top. Others describe the sensation of being followed up the stairs by footsteps that stop whenever they stop and resume when they continue climbing. One of the most disturbing phenomena reported at the Winchester Mystery House is the sound of gunshots echoing through the halls. These aren't random noises that could be mistaken for backfiring cars or construction work. They're clearly the sharp crack of rifle fire, sometimes single shots, sometimes volleys that seem to go on for minutes at a time. Could these be the sounds of the Winchester rifles that killed so many people, somehow playing out eternally within the house? The house's numerous mirrors are another source of supernatural activity. Visitors regularly report seeing figures in the mirrors that aren't visible in the actual room. Some describe seeing Civil War soldiers, Native American warriors, and other figures who appear to be victims of Winchester rifles. These mirror apparitions often seem to be trying to communicate, mouthing words that can't be heard or pointing at things that aren't there. But here's what makes the Winchester Mystery House truly unique among America's haunted buildings. Unlike other locations where the supernatural activity seems chaotic or random, the hauntings here appear to follow Sarah Winchester's rules. The spirits seem to be contained within the maze-like structure she built for them, following the confusing pathways she designed, unable to escape the architectural prison she created. Some paranormal investigators believe that Sarah Winchester didn't just build a house. She built a supernatural containment facility, a place where troubled spirits could exist without bothering the living world. If that's true, then the Winchester Mystery House isn't just haunted. It's a repository for restless souls, a supernatural storage facility that's still operating according to its creator's intentions. But there's a darker theory. What if Sarah Winchester's plan worked too well? What if the house has become a magnet for troubled spirits from all over the world, drawing them in like moths to a flame? What if the maze-like structure that was meant to confuse and contain spirits has instead become a supernatural hotel that never stops accepting new guests? That possibility becomes even more chilling when you consider that people still disappear in the Winchester Mystery House today. Not permanently, of course, but visitors regularly get lost in the maze-like corridors, wandering for hours through rooms and hallways that seem to shift and change around them. Some emerge from their experience claiming that they encountered rooms that don't appear on any floor plan, or that they had conversations with other visitors who turned out not to exist. The Winchester Mystery House offers tours year-round, but they warn visitors that the building's layout is genuinely confusing and that people with claustrophobia or anxiety should exercise caution. What they don't warn you about is the possibility that you might encounter something in those maze-like halls that wasn't part of Sarah Winchester's original plan. So the question isn't whether the Winchester Mystery House is haunted. The question is what happens when you build a house specifically designed to contain spirits, and then spend decades filling it with supernatural energy. Do you create a safe haven for restless souls, or do you create something far more dangerous? Keep that question in mind, because our next haunted building will challenge everything you think you know about the relationship between the living and the dead. Sometimes, the most dangerous ghosts are the ones who don't realize they're dead at all. Picture yourself aboard the most luxurious ocean liner ever built, surrounded by the elegance of a bygone era. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on polished wood paneling. The sound of your footsteps echoes through endless corridors. But as you explore deeper into the ship, you begin to realize you're not alone. And some of your fellow passengers have been aboard much longer than any human life would allow. The Queen Mary isn't just a haunted building. It's a floating city of the dead, a massive ocean liner that has become one of the most supernatural locations in America. And unlike other haunted places that you can visit and then leave behind, the Queen Mary is a confined space. Once you're aboard, you're trapped with whatever spirits call this ship home. Launched in 1936, the Queen Mary was the crown jewel of the Cunard Line, designed to be the fastest and most luxurious passenger ship in the world. For 3 decades, she carried celebrities, royalty, and wealthy passengers across the Atlantic in unprecedented comfort and style. But the ship's glamorous exterior concealed darker realities, and it's those hidden tragedies that continue to haunt the Queen Mary today. The ship's supernatural reputation began during her service years. Crew members reported strange occurrences almost from the beginning. Passengers would complain about hearing parties in empty ballrooms. People reported seeing figures in 1930s clothing walking the decks at night, always disappearing when approached. The ship's massive size meant that some areas were rarely visited, and it was in these forgotten spaces that the earliest ghost sightings occurred. But it was during World War II that the Queen Mary truly earned her reputation as a ship of the dead. Painted gray and stripped of luxury furnishings, the Queen Mary was converted into a troop transport ship capable of carrying 16,000 soldiers at a time. Officially designated HMS Curacao, she became known as the Grey Ghost for her ability to outrun enemy submarines. But speed came at a terrible cost. On October 2, 1942, the Queen Mary was carrying over 10,000 American troops when she accidentally rammed and sank the British cruiser HMS Curacao. The Queen Mary's massive hull sliced the smaller ship in half, killing 239 sailors instantly. Due to wartime security protocols, the Queen Mary couldn't stop to rescue survivors, leaving the men to drown in the cold Atlantic waters. This tragedy marked the beginning of the Queen Mary's transformation from luxury liner to haunted vessel. The ship's wartime service continued for 3 more years, during which time she transported over 800,000 soldiers. Cramped conditions, poor sanitation, and the stress of war led to numerous deaths aboard the ship. Soldiers died from disease, accidents, and suicide. Many of these deaths were covered up or minimized in official records, but the spirits of those who died aboard the Queen Mary weren't so easily dismissed. After the war, the Queen Mary returned to passenger service, but the supernatural activity only intensified. Passengers and crew reported encountering soldiers in World War II uniforms wandering the corridors. Some of these ghostly soldiers seemed lost and confused, as if they were still trying to find their way to their assigned quarters. Others appeared to be standing watch, as if still on duty decades after their deaths. When the Queen Mary was permanently docked in Long Beach, California, in 1967 and converted into a hotel and tourist attraction, the paranormal activity reached new levels of intensity. Without the constant motion and activity of an operational ship, the supernatural presences seemed to become more noticeable and more active. Room B340 quickly became notorious as the most haunted stateroom on the ship. Originally a first-class cabin, this room had been the site of multiple unexplained deaths during the ship's operational years. Guests staying in B340 reported extreme temperature fluctuations, the sound of running water when all taps were off, and the sensation of invisible hands touching them while they slept. But the most disturbing reports came from guests who claimed to see a man in 1930s evening were standing at the foot of their bed in the middle of the night. This figure, later identified as a passenger who had died in the room during the ship's luxury service years, would stand perfectly still, staring at sleeping guests until they woke up. The moment they made eye contact with the apparition, he would vanish. The supernatural activity in B340 became so intense that the Queen Mary's management eventually stopped renting the room to guests. It's now only accessible during special paranormal tours, and even then, visitors are warned about the potential for intense supernatural encounters. The ship's pool areas are another hotspot for paranormal activity. The Queen Mary had multiple swimming pools during her luxury service years, but they were drained and sealed when the ship was converted to a tourist attraction. However, visitors still report hearing the sounds of splashing water and children playing in these empty, dry spaces. Most unsettling are the reports of seeing a young girl in a 1930s bathing suit playing alone in the drained first-class pool. She appears to be completely unaware that the pool is empty, splashing and swimming in water that isn't there. When approached, she looks up with a bright smile before slowly fading away. This spirit, believed to be a child who drowned in the pool during the ship's operational years, is one of the most frequently cited ghosts on the Queen Mary. The engine room tells perhaps the most tragic ghostly tale. This massive space, filled with enormous machinery and countless pipes, was the site of multiple accidental deaths during the ship's service years. Workers were crushed by moving parts, scalded by steam, or simply lost in the maze-like mechanical spaces and never found. Today, visitors to the engine room report encountering the spirit of a man in overalls who appears to still be working on the ship's machinery. He's been spotted checking gauges, adjusting valves, and performing maintenance tasks on equipment that hasn't operated in decades. When approached, he looks up with a confused expression, as if he doesn't understand why someone is interrupting his work, before disappearing into the shadows. But the most chilling supernatural phenomenon on the Queen Mary is the sound of the ship's horn blowing in the middle of the night. The horn hasn't been operational for years, and there's no mechanical way for it to sound. Yet residents of Long Beach regularly report being awakened by the deep, mournful sound of the Queen Mary's horn calling out across the harbor. Some paranormal experts believe the ghost horn is a warning, the ship's way of alerting the living to supernatural danger. Others think it's a distress call from the spirits trapped aboard, a supernatural SOS that echoes across the decades. The Queen Mary's restaurant and ballroom areas host their own collection of spirits. Staff members report seeing elegantly dressed couples dancing in empty ballrooms, always to music that no one else can hear. These ghostly dancers appear to be recreating parties from the ship's golden age, forever celebrating occasions that ended decades ago. But here's what makes the Queen Mary truly unique among America's haunted locations. Most haunted buildings are tied to specific locations on land. You can visit them, experience the supernatural activity, and then leave. The Queen Mary is different. It's a self-contained supernatural environment, a floating city where the dead and the living exist in the same confined space. When you're aboard the Queen Mary, especially overnight, you're not just visiting a haunted location. You're temporarily joining a community that includes both living people and spirits who have been residents for decades. You're sharing dining rooms, corridors, and sleeping quarters with entities that exist in a different reality but occupy the same physical space. This creates a unique form of supernatural encounter. The ghosts of the Queen Mary don't just appear and disappear. They interact with the ship's environment in ways that affect living visitors. Elevators operate on their own, taking passengers to floors they didn't select. Doors open and close without human intervention. The ship's public address system occasionally crackles to life with announcements in languages and accents from different eras. Some visitors report that the supernatural activity on the Queen Mary seems to intensify during bad weather, as if the spirits are responding to the same conditions that would have affected them in life. During storms, the ghostly activity increases dramatically, with multiple sightings reported throughout the ship simultaneously. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Queen Mary's paranormal activity is how it seems to follow some visitors home. People who spend time aboard the ship, particularly overnight guests, frequently report supernatural encounters continuing for weeks after their visit. Some describe dreams where they're back aboard the ship, participating in events from decades past. Others report sensing the presence of specific spirits they encountered during their visit. It's as if the Queen Mary's ghosts don't just haunt the ship. They form connections with living visitors, creating supernatural bonds that transcend the physical boundaries of the vessel itself. So when you visit the Queen Mary, you're not just taking a tour of a haunted location. You're potentially joining a supernatural community that spans multiple generations and dimensions of existence. And once you become part of that community, you might find that leaving the ship doesn't mean leaving its spirits behind. But our next haunted building presents an even more disturbing possibility. What happens when the supernatural activity isn't just scary, but actually dangerous? What happens when ghosts don't just want to be noticed, but actively try to harm the living? Our final destination isn't just America's most famous haunted house. It's ground zero for a supernatural phenomenon so intense and well documented that it changed how the entire world thinks about paranormal activity. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, represents the intersection of mass murder, demonic possession, and evil so concentrated that it continues to affect everyone who comes into contact with the property, even decades after the original horror began. The Amityville horror story begins on November 13, 1974, when 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered his entire family with a high-powered rifle while they slept in their beds. Father, mother, 2 brothers, and 2 sisters, all shot to death in what appeared to be a methodical execution carried out by the eldest son. DeFeo claimed he heard voices commanding him to kill his family, voices that seemed to come from the house itself. But the DeFeo murders were just the beginning of the Amityville horror. 13 months later, on December 18, 1975, George and Kathy Lutz moved into the house with Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage. They knew about the murders but were attracted by the house's beauty and the significantly reduced price. What they didn't know was that they were moving into what may be the most supernaturally active location in American history. The Lutz family's 28 days in the Amityville house became the most documented case of supernatural possession in modern times. But this wasn't a typical haunting with occasional strange occurrences. This was a sustained supernatural assault that escalated daily until the family was forced to flee for their lives, leaving behind all their possessions in their desperation to escape. The supernatural activity began immediately upon the family's arrival. Doors and windows would open and close on their own, often with enough force to slam shut and wake the entire household. The temperature would drop dramatically in specific rooms for no apparent reason, and family members would wake up to find frost on the inside of windows even when the outside temperature was above freezing. But these physical manifestations were nothing compared to the psychological assault that the house seemed to be conducting on its new residents. George Lutz, a previously stable and successful businessman, began experiencing personality changes within days of moving into the house. He became obsessed with chopping wood in the middle of the night, often working until dawn with no memory of how long he had been outside. He would wake up at 3:15 a.m. every night, the exact time that the DeFeo murders had occurred, and feel compelled to check the house's security. Kathy Lutz began having vivid nightmares about the murders, dreaming in detail about events she had never witnessed and couldn't possibly know. She aged dramatically during their brief stay in the house, with photographs showing her appearing to have aged years in just a few weeks. She also began experiencing what can only be described as supernatural physical attacks, waking up with scratches and bruises that appeared overnight. But it was the children who experienced the most terrifying supernatural encounters. 9-year-old Daniel Lutz reported having conversations with an invisible friend named Jody, who appeared to him as a large pig with glowing red eyes. Jody would tell Daniel about the house's history and warn him about dangers that were coming to the family. When adults couldn't see Jody, Daniel would describe the entity's location and movements with perfect accuracy, as if he was seeing something that was invisible to others. The youngest child, 5-year-old Missy, began speaking to an invisible playmate she called Jody as well, but her descriptions of the entity were even more disturbing. She described Jody as a pig-like creature that could change its size and appearance, sometimes appearing as a friendly animal and other times manifesting as a terrifying monster with glowing eyes and sharp teeth. But the supernatural presence in the house wasn't limited to invisible entities. The family regularly experienced what can only be described as poltergeist activity on an industrial scale. Furniture would move across rooms on its own. Heavy objects would fly through the air and strike family members. Doors would slam with enough force to crack their frames. The house's basement became a focal point for the most intense supernatural activity. George Lutz discovered a small room behind the basement stairs that had been painted completely red, including the ceiling and floor. The room was barely large enough for a person to stand in, and it emanated a smell that George described as a combination of perfume and death. When George investigated this red room further, he found what appeared to be a well that had been covered over. Local records showed no indication that a well had ever been dug in that location, but the ground was soft and seemed to extend much deeper than the house's foundation should allow. The red room's temperature was consistently 20 degrees warmer than the rest of the basement, and family members reported feeling watched whenever they entered the area. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the supernatural activity was how it seemed to be escalating with each passing day. What began as subtle phenomena quickly evolved into overt attacks on family members. George would find himself surrounded by invisible flies that only he could see, swarms of insects that would disappear the moment other family members entered the room. Kathy began experiencing what she described as invisible hands touching her inappropriately, sensations that would occur in front of other family members who could see her reaction but couldn't see the cause. She also began finding mysterious substances on the walls and floors of the house. Red sticky material that appeared overnight and couldn't be identified or completely cleaned away. The children reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the house, particularly in the stairwell and upper hallways. These weren't glimpses of movement in peripheral vision. The children described seeing full-body apparitions that would watch them from doorways or follow them from room to room. The entities appeared to be wearing hooded robes and moved in ways that suggested they weren't bound by normal physical limitations. Religious intervention only seemed to make the supernatural activity more aggressive. When Father Ralph Pecoraro visited the house to perform a blessing, he was physically assaulted by invisible forces and told by a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves to get out. Father Pecoraro developed a high fever and blisters on his hands that lasted for weeks after his visit to the house. The family's attempts to document the supernatural activity with cameras and recording equipment were consistently thwarted. Cameras would malfunction, film would be exposed, and recording devices would either fail to work or capture sounds and voices that seemed to threaten the family with escalating violence if they continued their documentation efforts. By January 14, 1976, just 28 days after moving into the house, the supernatural activity had become so violent and persistent that the Lutz family fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind their belongings, their furniture, and their investment in the property. They never returned to collect their possessions and never spent another night under the same roof together as a family. But leaving the Amityville house didn't end their supernatural ordeal. The Lutz family reported that the paranormal activity followed them to their new homes. George continued to wake up at 3:15 a.m. every night for months after leaving Amityville. Kathy continued to have nightmares about the house and experienced supernatural phenomena wherever she lived. The children struggled with behavioral problems and reported continued contact with invisible entities that claimed to be from the Amityville house. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue has changed hands multiple times since the Lutz family's escape, but the supernatural activity has never stopped. Subsequent owners have reported similar phenomena: doors and windows operating on their own, dramatic temperature fluctuations, strange odors, and the sensation of being watched by invisible entities. But what makes the Amityville case unique isn't just the intensity of the supernatural activity. It's how well documented and thoroughly investigated the case has been. Paranormal researchers, journalists, and skeptics have studied the house for decades, and while debates continue about specific details, the core facts remain undisputed. Something supernatural occurred in that house that was powerful enough to drive a family from their home and continue affecting them for years afterward. The house has been investigated by some of the most respected names in paranormal research, including Ed and Lorraine Warren, who concluded that the property was not just haunted but was actually possessed by an inhuman demonic entity. Their investigation revealed a history of supernatural activity that preceded the DeFeo murders and seemed to intensify after the mass killing. According to the Warrens' research, the house was built on land that had been used by the Shinnecock Indian tribe as a place to isolate mentally ill and dying members of their community. The land was considered cursed by the tribe, and they eventually abandoned it because of supernatural occurrences that made it uninhabitable. But the demonic presence that the Warrens identified wasn't connected to the land's history or the DeFeo murders. They concluded that the house had become a portal for an ancient evil that used tragic events like mass murder to gain power and influence in the physical world. If their theory is correct, then the Amityville house isn't just haunted. It's possessed by an entity that actively seeks to create more tragedy and suffering. This theory gains credibility when you consider what happened to people connected to the Amityville case. Ronald DeFeo Jr., who murdered his family, has spent decades in prison claiming that voices from the house commanded him to commit the killings. George Lutz struggled with alcohol abuse and depression for years after leaving the house, and his marriage to Kathy eventually ended in divorce. Several people who worked on books, movies, or investigations related to the case have reported experiencing supernatural harassment that began during their involvement with the story. The house continues to affect its occupants today. Current residents prefer to remain anonymous, but neighbors report ongoing supernatural activity, including strange lights, unexplained sounds, and the occasional sight of figures moving through the house when no one should be home. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Amityville horror is how it seems to spread its influence beyond the physical boundaries of the house itself. People who visit the property, even briefly, often report supernatural experiences that continue long after they leave. Paranormal investigators have documented cases where people who simply drove past the house began experiencing phenomena in their own homes. This has led some researchers to theorize that the Amityville house has become what they call a supernatural broadcaster, a location that emanates paranormal energy across a wide area and can affect anyone who comes into contact with it, even indirectly. If that's true, then the house at 112 Ocean Avenue isn't just America's most haunted building. It's a supernatural weapon that continues to spread evil and suffering to anyone who encounters it, creating an ever-expanding network of paranormal activity that may never be contained or stopped. That possibility should terrify you, because it means that evil doesn't always stay where it started. Sometimes, it finds a way to reach out and touch people who thought they were safe from its influence. So there you have it, 10 locations across America where death, suffering, and evil have left permanent marks on the physical world. From the elegant Stanley Hotel where Stephen King found his inspiration, to the Amityville horror house where demons made themselves at home, these buildings stand as proof that some tragedies are too intense to fade away with time. Each of these locations tells the same terrifying truth: that human suffering can become so concentrated in a place that it transforms the building itself into something supernatural. Whether it's the tuberculosis patients at Waverly Hills, the tortured prisoners of Eastern State Penitentiary, or the victims of Delphine LaLaurie's sadistic experiments, the dead refused to rest when their deaths were marked by extreme trauma, injustice, or evil. But here's what should really keep you awake tonight. These 10 buildings aren't unique. They're just the most famous examples of a phenomenon that occurs throughout America. In every state, in every city, there are places where tragedy has left supernatural scars that continue to bleed into the present. The question isn't whether these places are really haunted. The question is what happens when you visit them. Do you risk bringing some of that supernatural energy home with you? Do you become part of their story, another chapter in their ongoing tale of supernatural activity? And that brings me to something that might interest you even more than these buildings. Because while we've explored America's most haunted structures tonight, there are locations across this country where the supernatural activity isn't contained within walls. Places where entire areas pulse with paranormal energy, where the land itself has become a gateway between our world and something much darker. If you want to explore locations where you don't just visit the supernatural, but step into landscapes where reality itself becomes questionable, then you need to watch my next video about the 10 most haunted places in America. We're talking about forests where people vanish without a trace, battlefields where ghostly armies still fight their eternal war, and cemeteries that serve as gathering places for entities that were never human at all. These aren't just haunted buildings you can visit and leave behind. These are places that can change you permanently, locations where the barrier between the living and the dead has been erased entirely. And unlike the buildings we've explored tonight, these places are much harder to escape once they've marked you as their own. So if you're brave enough to journey beyond haunted buildings and into America's most supernaturally active landscapes, click on that end screen now. But I have to warn you, after you learn about these places, you might never feel completely safe anywhere again. Because once you understand how deep America's supernatural roots really grow, you'll realize that the dead aren't just in old buildings. They're everywhere. Sweet Dreams, Ancient Ram in Wotton-under-Edge, England. Wait, you might be thinking, England? But this is about America's most haunted buildings. Well, you're right to notice that, but I included the Ancient Ram in because its story connects directly to American supernatural history in ways that will absolutely terrify you. Plus, understanding this place will help you comprehend the true nature of what makes our next American location so horrifically haunted. Let me paint you a picture that will haunt your dreams. Imagine sleeping in a bed where you're regularly attacked by invisible entities, where objects fly across the room without explanation, and where the spirits aren't just unfriendly, they're actively malevolent. The Ancient Ram Inn isn't just haunted. It's possessed by something that feeds on human fear and suffering. Built in 1145, the Ancient Ram Inn sits on what experts believe to be one of the most spiritually active locations in the world. The building was constructed on the intersection of two ley lines, ancient energy paths that some believe connect sacred sites across the globe. But if ley lines can channel positive spiritual energy, they can also serve as highways for much darker forces. Archaeological excavations around the inn have uncovered evidence of ritualistic human sacrifice dating back thousands of years. The property sits on what was once a pagan burial ground where Druids conducted ceremonies that included the sacrifice of children and adults to appease ancient gods. But unlike other locations where ancient rituals might have left residual spiritual energy, the Ancient Ram Inn seems to have become a permanent portal for supernatural entities that are actively hostile to living humans. Now here's where the American connection becomes terrifying. The Ancient Ram Inn is owned by John Humphreys, who has documented over 50 years of supernatural attacks that parallel cases throughout the American Midwest and Northeast. The entities that inhabit the inn aren't just ghosts of people who died there. They're something much more dangerous, and similar entities have been documented in several American locations, including our next haunted building. Humphreys reports being physically attacked nightly by invisible entities that scratch him, pull him from his bed, and throw objects at him. These aren't gentle, ghostly touches. They're violent assaults that leave physical evidence in the form of scratches, bruises, and puncture wounds. He's documented thousands of photographs showing orbs, shadow figures, and what appear to be demonic entities manifesting in his home. But the most disturbing aspect of the ancient ram in's paranormal activity is how it seems to feed on human presence. Visitors consistently report that their electronic devices drain completely within minutes of entering the building, even when fully charged. People experience sudden onset of exhaustion, nausea, and disorientation that disappears the moment they leave the property. It's as if something in the building is literally consuming their life energy. The inn's bedrooms host the most violent supernatural activity. Guests who have been brave enough to spend the night report being dragged from their beds by invisible hands, having their covers ripped away, and being subjected to what can only be described as supernatural sexual assault. These encounters are so consistent and so intense that Humphreys no longer allows overnight guests. But here's where it gets truly terrifying, and where the connection to American hauntings becomes clear. The entities at the ancient ram inn don't just attack people physically. They seem to attach themselves to visitors, following them home and continuing the supernatural harassment for months or even years after their visit. American paranormal investigators who have visited the ancient ram inn report that the supernatural activity followed them back to the United States. They describe ongoing attacks in their own homes, the appearance of shadow figures that match descriptions from the inn, and electronic equipment malfunctions that began during their visit to England and never stopped. This suggests that whatever inhabits the ancient ram inn isn't bound by geographical location. It's a type of supernatural entity that can travel, attach itself to living people, and establish new centers of activity wherever its victims go. And that brings us to why I'm telling you about this English location in a video about American haunted buildings. Because the same type of entities that possess the ancient ram inn have been documented at several locations throughout the United States. These aren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They're something much more dangerous, something that actively hunts living humans and feeds on their fear, pain, and life energy. Our next American haunted building hosts exactly this type of malevolent supernatural presence. Understanding what happens at the ancient ram inn will help you comprehend the true horror of what awaits visitors at our 8th American location.